How many times did you come out on a Monday night, huh? I think it says a lot about this evening and about the people who are here, about your interests, about your commitment, about the community that we have here in Madison. And I really want to thank you for coming. My name is Ben Mansky. I serve as Executive Director of the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution. And you know, every time I say that, some people start cheering, especially when we get to the Democratic Revolution part.
Frankie talks a lot about in many of her works, especially this most recent book, and that's what really touches me when I hear about her vision for democracy in the U.S. and around the world. And I'm really grateful for Liberty Tree introducing me to Frankie. It's her vision that really fuels the work that we do, building a democracy movement, an aggressive, proactive movement to change the rules in all areas of society.
But I want to take you back to when I was 26 years old, this struggling young person sitting in the UC Berkeley library. And my intuition was that if I could just follow the food, if I could just understand why hunger, that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics. And the experts were telling us that we had run out of the Earth's capacity to feed us. We were reaching the limits. It was over. And yet, in my own modest following my nose research, I learned that in fact, that we were taking 16 pounds of grain and soy to produce 1 pound of beef, that I could bathe for months for the amount of water that we were using to produce 1 pound of beef, that we were destroying our water, our groundwater, our soil in this process that we called growth. And I said, wait a minute, actually what's going on is we are creating the very scarcity that we say we fear. Actually, there's more than enough food to feed us all well. And in fact, it's still true. So, that then became the question. Why hunger in a world of plenty? And then over the decades, it grew. It grew and it grew to this question. How can we make sense of the fact that we are creating, as societies, a world that we as individuals abhor? It makes no sense. What could be powerful enough to have us creating a world that violates our sensibilities? Because not one of us gets up in the morning and says, yeah, I want to make sure another child dies of hunger today. And yet thousands are. And not one of us gets up in the morning and says, yes, global heating is a great thing. I want to create millions of refugees and decimate species. It's a great thing. What can I do? Not one of us. So how do we make sense of this? Over the decades, I've come to believe that there is only one thing powerful enough, and that is the power of ideas, as strange as it sounds. I'm arguing that ideas are more powerful than instinct. And we can talk about that, but just I believe that we've proven it to be true. Now, when I say that, I realize that I've been influenced by many, many great thinkers, but none more powerfully than Erich Fromm. Do many of you remember of my generation? I always point to my hair, my generation. Erich Fromm, The Art of Loving and all of that in the 60s. Well, he wrote a book that I only read about 8 years ago called The Anatomy of Humandestructiveness. And in this book is one line that rattled me, and my daughter and I lifted and used in our book, Hope's Edge. It is this. It is man's humanity that makes him so inhuman. What is Fromm getting at? It is our distinct capacity to create ideas about the world, what he calls frames of orientation, and Anna and I call our mental map, that literally, now the neuroscientists are telling us, literally determine what we can see and what we cannot see, and therefore what we ultimately believe is human nature, and therefore what is possible. What is the mental map? That is all telling. Now, this unique, or at least distinct capacity of humanity, it's all well and good if we're alive at a time when the dominant mental map is life-serving. But my thesis is that the challenge for us at this extraordinary moment for our species, and now, of course, because of us, millions of others, is that the dominant mental map, now going global, is fundamentally life-denying. Here's what I mean by that. I'm claiming that it starts from a premise of lack of goods and lack of goodness. There's not enough stuff for us all, nature is too stingy, and certainly there's not enough goodness inside of us. Not enough goods or goodness. Because we, if you really peel away the fluff from human nature, what are we? We are simply these narrow, competitive, selfish materialists out to get our sort of fight each other in the giant mall. That's all we can really count on. So, if we believe that about ourselves, of course we can't believe that we can come together in deliberative processes. You know, that idea, democracy? No. That's not possible. We are too limited. So we have to find infallible, impersonal law of some sort to which we can turn over outcomes because we are too flawed ourselves. And over the centuries, many have thought they found it. John D. Rockefeller called it the law of God and of nature. And then Ronald Reagan got more poetic and he called it magic, the magic of the market. And then, of course, we come to this idea that not just any kind of market, but one kind of market. I mean, markets have been part of human social interaction for millennia, but not any kind of market, one kind of market, driven by one rule, highest return to existing wealth. People who own the shares. So wealth concentrates and concentrates and concentrates until it reaches the point today that one family in this country, one family, controls as much wealth as 40% of the population put together. Do you know what family that is? Got it. So here we are. With such concentration following, I'm arguing from this premise, then we turn over our fate to what kind of government? To this thin notion that democracy is simply a set of structures that we inherit, something done to us or for us, something distant, and that's something that we must keep very, very limited. And so what happens? Wealth concentrates to the point that it infects and warps our political system, so that we now have 61 lobbyists in Washington for every person that you and I have voted for to protect us. And concentration of wealth is so tight then that it kills both political democracy and a truly fair and open market, which was the whole idea to begin with, right? So I was wondering, why we didn't get it a long time ago. And I've been thinking about all the people who warned us. And one in particular has come to my attention who deserves all of our gratitude, even though we didn't listen to her. How many of you have ever heard of Lizzie Magie? Lizzie was a Quaker woman in the early 1900s, and she thought, I've got it. If I could just create a board game, and I think they drew it on tablecloths, a board game where people could play and see that if the rules are such that wealth returns to wealth, then the game will be over soon because somebody will have all the property. Well, it got into the hands of Parker Brothers, became monopoly, and it proved her point because now there are only 5 companies that control most board games in America. So I think we ought to honor Lizzie, even though we didn't heed her warning. Now, in my case, my brother was always the winner. And actually, I wasn't too sad because I got to go to bed. But, in real life, we want to keep playing, right? So we've got to make sure the rules allow that. So here we are. We've been warned by Lizzie and by many other great thinkers, but perhaps no more eloquently by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1938, in April, he was addressing a joint session of Congress, and he said, "The liberty of democracy is not safe if we tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." Now, I have to say, I haven't found the courage yet to use the F word without quoting an American president. But I'm getting close. My daughter just emailed me a definition of fascism from Mussolini. And it's very similar, except that, of course, he's praising it. It is the union of corporate power with the state. So this combo, this duo joined at the hip of elections plus a market economy, one rule economy, we think, we've got democracy. I call that thin democracy, and I consider that a pretty charitable term for it. But thin democracy, I believe, has always been inadequate. Today, it is dangerous. So I just want to spend a couple of moments explaining why it is dangerous. It is dangerous. It is dangerous because it excludes the problem solvers, us. In other words, it makes us feel powerless precisely at the moment when our global problems are so deep, so interconnected, so pervasive that they require for solutions the contagious engagement of billions of us, our buy-in, our ingeniousness that comes out of direct experience, all of which is excluded by thin democracy that tells us we have to turn over our fate to others. But I'll also argue that thin democracy is dangerous because it is misaligned with human nature in two ways. First, it is misaligned with human nature because let me just say more generally. It's misaligned with human nature because it doesn't tap the best in us or protect us from the worst in us. So when I say it doesn't tap the best in us, I'm saying that this shabby caricature of ourselves that I described earlier, it forgets. It ignores that human beings are richly complex creatures and that actually we have at least 4 deep, and now I love the neuroscience that's telling us that these are hardwired needs and capacities. So I'll mention just 4 that I think are at the basis of what I see emerging, taking us beyond thin democracy, and that thin democracy does not register, does not tap. One is our joy and need for cooperation. And the new neuroscience, the MRI scans are now showing when we cooperate versus compete, that actually when we cooperate, parts of our brains are stimulated that are the same parts that light up when we eat chocolate. And I love this. The scientist said, isn't it so surprising that cooperation is pleasant? And I cracked up when I heard that. I thought, how did they think we got to 6.whatever billion unless cooperation was pleasant? I don't know. And empathy as part of that, I was so touched by a recent study. It's not just empathy, of course. I mean, babies, for example, human babies cry at the sound of other babies crying, but not at recordings of their own voice. But it's not just human beings. Surely we are as empathetic as rhesus monkeys. And in a study done with them, and don't think about how this was done, just the results, they found that rhesus monkeys, bless their hearts, they would deny themselves food for up to 12 days if they learned that by pressing the button to get food for themselves, they would cause pain to another rhesus monkey for 12 days. So those aspects, I'm convinced, are hardwired in us. But also, on this, I just want to ask you. I think this statement is so captures what I'm about to say. It is the great precept of nature to love ourselves only as we love our neighbors, or what comes to the same thing, as our neighbors are capable of loving us. Do you know who said that? Adam Smith. Isn't that interesting? The supposed godfather of greed. Well, there is another Adam Smith. And in fact, I quote in the book that Ben was mentioning, I was so struck in the research for that book that Adam Smith was one of the most beautiful moral philosophers in our history. And another thing that Adam Smith was very aware of is that and now there's more and more anthropology that is theorizing the same, is that we evolved, yes, in tightly woven tribes that understood that we depended on one another, and that what holds community together is fairness, fair rules that are fairly enforced, justice. And so Adam Smith, I understood that during the Reagan years they wore Adam Smith neckties in the White House. They really did see him as the godfather of greed. Adam Smith wrote, other social sentiments are optional, but he said, quote, "We are in some peculiar manner tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice." 3, so cooperation, fairness, and also efficacy, power. We didn't evolve to be couch potatoes. And here I love to quote Erich Fromm, my mentor here. He turned Descartes around and he said, human beings so need efficacy that we should really say, I am because I affect. Then democracy denies us that need for power. And finally, then democracy ignores the deep, deep need for purpose, for common purpose, not common purchase, common purpose. And so it is dangerous in yet another way, misaligned with our nature in yet another way, because by not offering a sense of common purpose with our fellows, it leaves the door wide open to extremists of all sorts who claim a higher moral calling and an absolutism. So thin democracy is dangerous on that ground. But it is also dangerous because, as I'm arguing, it doesn't protect us from the worst in us, doesn't bring out the best or protect us from the worst. And what I mean here is quite simply that human history is pretty clear on what brings out the worst in us and the best. History, whether we're looking at the history of genocide, whether we're looking at what happened in Abu Ghraib, or in lab experiments in which we humans are the guinea pigs, so to speak. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Stanford prison experiment, which is the same year that Diet for a Small Planet was published, 1971, in which young people were put in prison, a mock prison that had the guards and the prisoners. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. They had to stop it in 6 days because within 2 days there was such brutality, eerily similar to the Abu Ghraib brutality. What I'm suggesting then is that we know that given the right, that is wrong conditions, human beings will brutalize one another. Not just a few, but most of us. So, what are those conditions? One certain one that is a given in thin democracy, one certain one is the concentration of power now so incredibly extreme in this country. Another one, clearly, that is brought out in any of these examples that we might cite about our brutality that's showing up is anonymity. And anonymity is what is built into a globalized, centralized economy in which we never see those and kind of hard to imagine those who produce what we use. So thin democracy is a setup to bring out the worst in us. So fortunately, and in the nick of time, I believe you and Madison are part of what I see as a global emergence, a revolution in human dignity that I call living democracy. It is no longer this thin notion of something we inherited, fixed, finished, done. As William Hastie, the first African-American federal judge, put it, it is not being, it is becoming. It is easily lost, but never finally won. So living democracy, what is it? It is not a set system, but is a set of system values that continue to evolve with each generation. A set of system values that permeate and infuse all aspects of our lives together. It is a very different notion of democracy. And therefore, it encompasses not just elections and the political system, but just as centrally our economic life, our educational life, our community life, all aspects of our lives. And in that, then, what kinds of values are we talking about? And I hope I have made clear, this is not a new ism. This is not a new blueprint. This is not a fixed point we arrive at. It is the journey. And sometimes I think of it like this, that as our eyes open to now understand ecology, and remember that ecology, really even the term emerged in my adult lifetime, that we're seeing the world as relationship, in which networks are constantly creating, and we are creating one another through networks. Somehow I think of living democracy as the social analog of ecology itself.